was having a meal with some family members. We had my dad over, and he was saying, we were talking about Father Lenny Andre, who used to be at St. Mike's. And he was saying, yeah, one time Father Andre gave a homily about the Holy Spirit being like chocolate syrup that you put in milk and then you stir it all around. And he says, a great image, great homily, and so he decided to give Father Andre a couple jugs of chocolate syrup the next day. And I said, I was doing a homily once, and I just happened to mention Reese's Pieces, and the next day, lo and behold, someone had given me Reese's Pieces, and I said, one time I also mentioned duct tape, and I received duct tape a week later. So they're saying, man, you gotta mention something valuable in your homily, next time. So today's homily will be on the familiar our time, our talent, our treasure, and our Teslas. My kids love Teslas. Their aunt has a Tesla, and they've gotten to drive in them, and I've driven one, and it's really interesting to, they have the technology where it kind of self-drives on the freeway, and they can tell a Tesla from like a mile away. As somehow they can spot it. So I'm going to mention Teslas in this homily. It's interesting that the gospel uses the word talent, because, talent was originally referring to kind of a weight or a measure that the Jewish people used to measure something out. So it had more of that meaning, but somehow it's filtered into our English language where we hear talent. And of course, that conjures up our talents, right? And it's so appropriate in that respect as well. And so I think it's a fortunate choice that we have that word talent, because though it can be related to money and to resources, it can also be related to other things that we have given. And the fact remains that something was given to the servant in this parable that didn't belong to him. So the talent represents something that didn't belong to him that was given to him. And the servant was supposed to be a steward of this. And Jesus seems to be communicating, he's deliberately teaching this fact. He's communicating the truth that we are servants, as we are stewards of our time, talent, our treasure, and our Teslas, and that these gifts are not primarily given for our personal gain, but for the gain of God. And this, when we become Christians, this is sort of a seismic shift in our thinking of the things that we have been given. We realize we have been given things, and that our job is to return them to the one who gave them to us. And a lot of people in life don't make this sort of mental shift in their lives. And the parable can also be about highlighting the fact that people get different amounts of talent. One got 5, one got 2, and another got 1. And to our sort of imperfect vision, life is not fair. But we know it's not about how much we get, but about what we do with it. And we know that good coaches, right, have the ability to take someone at a certain level, whether it's a 1 or a 2 or a 5 talent person, and lift them up to a higher level. And that makes for a really good coach. Not just a coach who can take a bunch of 5s and make a great team out of them, but a coach that can take folks with all different abilities. And some see that perhaps the main point of this parable is the part that I didn't read, and that's on your sheet there, the part about the person who is given 1 and then hides it, right? Out of fear of the master, and the master comes back and doesn't like the fact that he did that. So some people see that that's the kind of the main point of the parable. And so we could take a vote, perhaps. You're probably tired of votes, but we could take a vote as to, what is Jesus primarily communicating during or using this parable. And that's one of the cool things about a parable is that it's designed or it can be used to touch us in many different ways. And so we need to listen to the parable. And what is God saying to me personally? What's the aspect of the parable that is intended for me this morning? So I'd like to share a story of a person who kind of illustrates some of the aspects of this story, this parable. Has anyone heard of George Strake? Anyone heard of George Strake? George Strake from Texas. George is glad that you probably haven't heard of him because he was an anonymous sort of guy. He was the youngest of 10 children. I can relate to that. I'm the second oldest of 10. He came from a poor family in Missouri. Both of his parents and 2 of his siblings died when he was very young. And so he dropped out of school to provide for his family. And it was at the kind of turn of the 20th century, and he was earning $9 a week, and he gave $2 a week to the Sunday collection at the parish and $7 to the family. What were George's talents? Well, as you can see, he was generous with his money. They say he had piercing blue eyes. They say he had kind of a commanding presence that marked him as a leader. George was really curious type of person. He was very inquisitive about everything. And he was an entrepreneur. He was a risk taker. And we've all met those sorts of folks. And so George left the security of a job, as entrepreneurs do, to pursue oil prospects in Mexico. And he became a wildcatter. A wildcatter. Wildcatters were, in the 1920s, were brave folks, perhaps slightly crazy. They're on the fringe of the oil industry, the folks that probably would say something like, there's gold in them there hills, and really, really wanted to find gold or oil and discover the big-time deposits. So he became a wildcatter, and he went to Mexico, to unexplored areas in Mexico. And he had some luck there, but then the Mexican Revolution came, and he was forced to leave the country. So he decides to go to Cuba, and he has the novel idea of trying to sell colored cars in Cuba. At that time, all the cars were black, and he tries his hand at doing that in Cuba. And then that didn't work out, so he tried a lumber business in Oregon. And then his mother-in-law gets sick in Texas. So he moves the family to Texas to care for her. And George loved to hunt, and he loved to roam around outdoors. And one day he was out roaming, and he noticed 2 strange things. He noticed that in one area, the livestock would not drink water that was kind of brackish in color. Wouldn't drink the water in that area. And then he noticed that in that same area, all of the creeks, instead of flowing normally southeast, all the creeks flowed northeast. And others had drilled for oil in this area, and they hadn't had any luck. But he had a hunch that there was oil down there, deep. So he asked his lovely wife to invest all the money that they had to see if there was oil down there. She said yes, under a certain condition. And the story goes, he dug deep, found natural gas, which wasn't very valuable back then, but he kept going, and almost a mile down, he found this huge Monroe oil field. And instantly, he became very, very rich. And although he was a miser himself, and though his wife was a spender, they still had tons and tons of money. But unlike other wildcatters who became rich, George Strake had the strange idea or belief that he was simply a stakeholder or a custodian of the vast oil fields. He thought that his discovery was a gift from God and that he had used his talents, which were also a gift from God, and that the wealth didn't belong to him. In fact, he lost almost all of that wealth a little bit later when massive explosions happened in the oil fields. And then they found a way to almost like frack sideways in and retrieve it. And George Strait used to say that he was a team of two with God. His job was to return the field's vast wealth to the causes that the master approved. So he devoted his money to causes like St. Joseph's Hospital, Boy Scouts, high schools, universities, but most of all to the Catholic Church. And that's where I learned about George Strait. I learned about him through a book by John O'Neill about the bones of St. Peter. George Strait had anonymously funded a secret, risky Vatican project to see if the bones of St. Peter under the Basilica in Rome were really there. And the scoffers said that there weren't bones there in the first place. Peter had never been to Rome, some said, and even if he had been to Rome and the bones were there, that the looters and marauders, the vandals, would have taken them, stolen them. And those same scoffers said, you know, you Catholics, the place that you Catholics chose for the seat of your church is really all based on a myth. But George Strait and Pope Pius XII were risk takers, and they weren't afraid of the truth. And this book tells about the story of the discovery of Peter's bones, and it is an amazing, dramatic story. I urge you, if you're interested in history or drama that's true, to look into that story. I think every Catholic should know that story. But what did God dish out to George Strait? Well, maybe he had a one sort of talent in the fact that he didn't have any parents for most of his life. The fact that he was poor, maybe he was on the short end of that. Maybe his piercing blue eyes was like a two talent, perhaps. And then, of course, the five. He gets the five talent when he discovers the oil. Not many of us will strike it rich like that. But his life, to me, is an example of the drama that plays out in each of our lives. What do we do with the hand that has been dealt to us? We each get, I'm confident that we each get high cards and we each get low cards. Some people think, oh, I just get a bunch of low cards. I don't believe that. I believe each of us gets high cards and low cards. But the question is, how are we going to play them in the service of God? So we are then custodians of the time that God gives us. Some people have lots of time. Some people have a little time. We don't know how much time we will get. And we are merely custodians of the money, the pile of money that God gives us, right? Whether it's big or whether it's small. And George kept a saying on his desk that read, God doesn't care how much money you have when you die. God does care what you did with the money that you had when you were alive. And whatever size piles you have, doesn't matter, right? It's how we do with it that matters. And remember that widow who gave just the couple cents into the plate. Remember, whatever size pile you have of money, whatever talents you have, great or small, whatever fortunes or misfortunes you've had in life, it's how you do with them that's the important thing. Remember that the parable also says the master invites the person with the 2 and the person with the 5 who used them properly, he said, "Come." He congratulated them and said, "Come, enter into your master's joy." So much for the stern master that we hear about in that parable. We hear about a master who invites us into his joy when we use our gifts for his glory. So when I get that Tesla, no. I think, as I was alluding to earlier, some people think, well, I really haven't received much in life. I've only got 1s or 2s. But we as Catholics can really rejoice that I believe the Eucharist is a 5. It's one of those high gifts that he gives to each of us. All of us possess this amazing gift of the Eucharist as Catholics. And so what are we going to do with the gifts that God gives us? How are we going to play our hand? How are we going to use what God has given us for his glory?